Thank you, Rachita, for the check. I don't know if we were. That's good. All right, so thank you so much. And again, let's get going. I'm going to go over to John if you want to share your screen and kick us off, and we'll do the poll.
Okay, sounds good. All right, did you want to do the poll, Ari?
Sure, yeah. So this is just going to be a poll. The first one's a multiple choice question. I'm going to launch it now, and it should show up on your screen. And it just says, like, who are you? Are you a student, a center director, a Bonner coordinator, faculty member, or other? So you can type in the chat. You can be more than one. So then just to give a sense of who is on this webinar. Got 30 of 31, so almost everyone, and that might be John that isn't voting, so I think we'll end the poll. We got 30 people on, that's awesome. So I'm gonna share the results so you all can see. So we've got 2 students, thank you for joining us, that's awesome. 8 center directors, 4 Bonner coordinators, 16 faculty, and 5 other, which, looking at the chat, that included Bonner Foundation staff member, an associate director of community engaged learning, Teresa, thank you, and a community engagement program coordinator. Awesome. So the next question we wanted to know, we just need you to type your answer in, which is, what is the name of the center, for those who are staff, or the department that you work in? And just type that in, so again, we can get a sense of like disciplines represented, names of centers, where they're housed.
Ari, is there a poll that's supposed to show up, or are we typing it in the chat?
No, you just have to type it in the chat. So we've got Center for Community Engagement, Communication Sciences, Sociology, Student Learning and Development, reporting to the Provost, a Department of Spanish and Latino Studies. Also Department of Teaching and Learning, Office of Service and Learning, the Earlham programs under the Center for Social Justice, School of Music, Honors College. All right, it's Tim. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And the last question, and this is so that we also will have a good record of who's on this webinar. If you could just type your name and if you want your title, you don't have to include it, and your email in the chat. Great. Just about everybody there. Thanks so much. And that helps us a lot to know who was part of this. And it also helps so that if other things come up during this time, we'll be able to email everybody who was part of it easily. So thanks. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get going with asking John the first question, and one of the things that you may have, those of you who've done some of the modules that we wrote, one of them, the first one actually includes an article from Tim Eatman, who's actually on this webinar too, talking that came from some research he and colleagues at Imagining America did related to pathways into becoming a community engaged scholar. And I was thinking, well, one of the first things to ask John to have him share with all of you is just a little bit more about his own story. And kind of, John, what brought you into this work? And right now, I can see your screen, John.
Okay,
so,
great,
yeah.
Ari, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also just want to say, Tim, I'm really glad you're on here, and we'll also be talking about full participation, which is a piece that Tim and I collaborated on as well. So,
Thanks, John.
I'll try to make this somewhat brief, but I kind of want to start with, I didn't come into this work really with any sense of what service learning or community engagement was. My training is as a historian. I'm an American historian, late 19th, early 20th century American intellectual and cultural history. Coming into community engagement work was completely new to me. It wasn't part of my graduate education. It wasn't like I did community service as an undergrad. So it's a really different experience than both the students that we have in our classrooms and the younger faculty who are coming into our institutions. And I want to talk more about that later. And then I got involved in community engagement. I sort of think of it as a pathway. This comes from a piece done in the early 2000s from the Association of Commonwealth Universities. But I like it in the sense that it sort of draws out these different dimensions of engagement. And so if we think about it sort of in this way, that there are different pathways in, I would say that my pathway into community engagement was through the pedagogical pathway. It was through teaching and learning. I got involved because I was teaching my history courses in very traditional ways. I would lecture, I was pretty good at it, but it was pretty unsatisfying. And so I started experimenting with other kinds of pedagogy. And one of those was service learning. And I really mean it as an experiment. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was just trying things out. And there was a little bit of literature to look at. There was a little bit of literature on service learning, a little bit on reflection, a little bit on community partnerships, and just trying to figure it out. But that was my way in. It was a way of teaching the course content in a more effective way. And I found that it was incredibly effective. So I felt like that was my way in. I'd also say that, pathway in doesn't mean that you get stuck in that pathway. So as soon as I started doing that work, I started attending much more to what would be on here, the partnership pathway, and also much more to the institutional pathway, in the sense that as a faculty member doing this, I found very quickly that there were sort of deep ethical considerations related to the community partnership work, and they went well beyond my course or me as a single individual faculty member, that they required a larger institutional response. And so immediately you start getting connected to these other pathways. And then the epistemological pathway on the bottom, I would say sort of came later in my engagement work, but that's, I would argue, sort of more where I'm at right now. So just in terms of where I came in, though, it was really around the teaching and learning piece. And again, I'll try to be brief with this. I was at Northeastern University at the time, and I started playing with service learning in an upper level history course. And in many ways, it was a very traditional cultural history course. And in other ways, it was really different in the sense that we reoriented it to be focused on the individual, community, and democracy. So everything we read focused on those themes, and then students were out in the community. at service sites and interrogating those sites around individualism, community, and democracy, and bringing it back into the classroom, and it was incredibly powerful. And then I started writing about it. And so this was a chapter I did in a series that came out at the time through AAHE, a series that Ed Zlotkowski had edited. And so this was the volume on history. And this is where I also began to get connected to networks of other scholars who were doing this work. And then again, just really briefly, I took a 2-year leave from Northeastern University to be the director for integrating service with academic study, which was a program at Campus Compact. So I was working out of the national office, and ended up staying there for 8 years. So I left a tenured position at Northeastern and worked out of the national office at Campus Compact. And then from there, I was recruited to go to UMass Boston, which is where I am now, to direct what was the New England Resource Center for Higher Education and teach in the higher education doctoral program. So that's sort of how I got into the work. And then I would say just kept getting deeper and deeper into that work. And then if you're interested, one of the pieces that I shared with Ari is this chapter of a book that just came out last year, which sort of goes deeper into this sort of this biography and also the research attached to it. So I'm just sharing that if you're interested. And I would also say this is an interesting volume in the sense that you get a lot of these stories and narratives and pathways into the work from a range of scholars who are doing community engagement work. So maybe we should pause there, Ari, in case there's anything people have questions about before we move on.
I muted myself and just made sure everyone was muted. So just in case you're going to speak, you can unmute. But that sounds great, John. Does anyone want to raise a question or comment? And you can do that too by going under the reaction and I think raising your hand or something, or just type your name in the chat or unmute yourself.
So Erin says she has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. I've always been curious, John, about your connection between your work with the Nearings, and has that at all fed into your work in terms of civic action?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't get that question very much, so I appreciate you raising that. Here's where I would say the connections are. Nearing, in many ways, although I didn't realize at the time I was studying him, became a real inspiration for my work as what I think of as being an activist scholar. And because in many ways he was a model for that. So for those who don't know sort of Nearing's story, his early career was as a faculty member in economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And he very deliberately brought the issues of Philadelphia into his classroom to understand questions of inequality and power. And it got him in a lot of trouble to the point where he was fired as a faculty member there. It was one of the first major academic freedom cases of the 20th century. It led to the forming of the American Association of University Professors. And he went on to another faculty position at the University of Toledo. He was actually a dean there and got fired again. So that became a kind of an interesting sort of context as I walked into this work. The other thing I would say is that maybe not so much Nearing, but my training as a historian actually has largely shaped a lot of the scholarship I do. And what I mean by that is that I because of my training, I think like a historian. And what I mean by that is that I pay attention to making connections, oftentimes between things that we don't necessarily see as connected. I pay attention to context, because that's sort of largely what historians do. And the other thing is I pay really close attention to language and meaning. Like that really matters for historians. And then the last is just coming out of the humanities, that values matter. And so my work tends to be largely values-based. So I don't do a lot of history work now, but I actually do all my work from a perspective and kind of mental stance as a historian. So I don't know if that helps.
All right, any other comments or questions?
Okay, and I'm more than happy to come back to stuff too, so don't feel like if you missed it now we can't come back to it. So Ari had asked me to talk about the democratic engagement white paper and full participation. And we can do that as sort of separate pieces, but I actually see them as a body of work connected to the next generation engagement work, which is another publication called Publicly Engaged Scholars. And while they are in some ways separate work, they build on one another and are very much connected to one another. So I want to sort of talk about them as a whole. So we'll go through them sort of separately, but I want to weave them together at the same time. So the democratic engagement work is largely centered on this paper, the Democratic Engagement White Paper, which is in 2009. And then it also ended up as a chapter in a book called To Serve a Larger Purpose. It also was a journal article in the British Journal of Education Studies. And it had wide readership, in part because we put the white paper just out on the ether. There was no ownership to it. We just kind of put it out there. And then we found that when you do that, you tend to have much greater impact than if you just do it through sort of a peer-reviewed journal process. And that's kind of what happened. So what we were trying to do was really fairly straightforward. We were trying to provide a framework around engagement that focused on the purposes and processes of engagement. And that was part of it, but the other part was that we wanted to connect that very specifically to what that meant for institutional change. So not just talk about engagement as an activity that takes place in communities that has a certain purpose and process, but that if you're going to actually do it in authentic and reciprocal ways, it requires change at the institution, and that you can't disassociate those two things. So that's what the paper tries to do. And then in the paper, we have this sort of chart to make distinctions between what we saw as civic engagement as it was traditionally being practiced on campuses, and then a form of democratic civic engagement, which was not what we were seeing in widespread ways, but what we thought we should be working towards. And so we were just trying to make distinctions between what this meant in terms of community relationships, knowledge production, epistemology. And when I talk about epistemology, which I'll keep talking about, what I mean by that is, how do we know what we know? How does knowledge get constructed? Who has knowledge? And then what knowledge is considered legitimate in the academy? So all these questions around knowledge and knowledge production. And then it has a political dimension, and then what do we think about in terms of the outcomes? But again, I focus a lot here on the knowledge production and epistemological piece. And this is sort of where we really think about who has knowledge, where are their knowledge assets, and when we think about engagement work, that those knowledge assets are outside of the university, outside the academy. So how do we bring them together with the knowledge assets within the academy? And that requires universities to orient their work differently. So that's where in the paper we talked about first order and second order change. And first order change, I think of as just really simply that we sort of tinker on the margins, but we don't ever really try to address what would be fundamental change in our institutions of higher education. But second order change is quite different. It asks us to really examine the core culture of the institution and begin to make fundamental changes around practices, policies, structures, culture, the things that are really hard to do, but that are really necessary if we're going to take engagement seriously. And so that kind of deep transformational change, and this work comes in many ways out of the work of Eckel, Hill, and Green from the late 90s. You see in the bottom right corner there, So it alters the culture of the institution. It's deep and pervasive, affecting the whole institution. It's intentional, and it occurs over time. And so when I think about second order change and thinking about it as culture change, you have to recognize that it's not going to happen quickly. And that in the literature would tell us that the kind of deep culture change takes at least a decade. So this requires long-term commitment on the part of institutions. And it requires sort of this sort of strategic approach that's going to withstand and sustain leadership changes. And then we have to really think then about how do we build this deeply into the culture of the institution so that it becomes in a way a permanent part of the institution and isn't sort of in this precarious stature where it could be vulnerable or disappear. And we can talk more about that too, particularly given the current circumstances. All right, and then the next piece is full participation, and I see this coming in some ways directly out of the democratic engagement work, because largely it was raising the democratic engagement work was really asking these questions about this deep cultural change that had to take place in our institutions. At the same time we were doing the democratic engagement work, there was this movement in civic engagement where there were these connections being made between diversity, inclusion, and equity work. And maybe that's actually a stretch. It was more sort of thin diversity work and community engagement. And here's what it looked like. It was campuses that were creating programs to work with underserved students in high schools to help prepare them to go to college, but never the college where the students who were doing the community service came from. Like it wasn't like they were being prepared to go to that college, they were being prepared to go to college just generally. And it felt like this really thin and very kind of unauthentic way of making the connections between diversity work and community engagement work. And so a group of us, Susan Sturm and Tim, who's on the call here, and myself and Adam Bush, started to just pull together the literature which existed in these different areas. And one area was around the community engagement work, and one area was around the diversity, inclusion, and equity work, and one area was around the student success work. But it turned out the literature pointed to deep connections between these bodies of literature and these areas of practice. So what we do in the full participation piece is we begin to make these connections. And we write about sort of this architecture of our institutions, which is again very much going back to sort of this institutional change piece, looking at how diversity and inclusion is connected to the public engagement work, which is connected to the success of underserved students. Or a different way of thinking of it is that collaborative ways of generating knowledge are connected to active and collaborative teaching and learning practices, which we know from lots of data now are related to increased success, particularly for underserved students. So the problem that we were facing as we put this together is that these things weren't being put together on campuses. And we felt like they really needed to, both for the good of the community engagement work going on, but also for the good of the diversity work going on. And if we're really going to pay attention to the success of our underserved students, then these connections had to be made. So that's the argument that we're making in the full participation piece. So I would say it was sort of upping the ante around where community engagement was prioritized in the institution, and then how other institutional priorities were connected to community engagement. I would say that this particular approach actually had real resonance on a number of campuses, and actually at a number of higher education institutions, organizations, which sort of picked this up and then started to do programmatic work on it. AAC and U did some work around it. Imagining America launched a significant program around it, and actually was one of the major collaborators around the full participation work. And then the other thing that was happening as we were doing the the full participation work is that it wasn't just about making these connections, but it was paying attention to who were the scholars that were actually already making these connections. And what we recognized is that there was a whole new generation of scholars, younger scholars coming into the academy. Again, Tim Eatman was doing research at the time on a project he called Publicly Engaged Scholars, and looking specifically at graduate students and early career faculty to try to understand how they were approaching community engagement. And what we found was that this new generation of scholars, and the literature supported all of this, they were much more likely to claim scholarly identities around community engaged scholarship. They were also much more likely to bring engaged teaching and learning practices into their classrooms. And when they did that, they were making connections with and contributing to the learning of underserved students in much more powerful ways. And they were also approaching their faculty role in ways in which they saw those roles as fundamentally integrated. In other words, that research wasn't separate from teaching, which wasn't separate from service, but they were all connected together, and in some ways they were inseparable. So there's this notion of integrated faculty roles. And so, again, it was the full participation work that sort of led us to recognize there's something going on generationally here that we really need to pay attention to. And part of what we were really concerned with is that our institutions weren't creating the kind of environment to both attract this next generation of publicly engaged scholars and allow them to really thrive as scholars within the institution. And I use that language deliberately because it's not about how to survive the institution, or not about how to best navigate the existing structures, but how do we create environments where these scholars can actually thrive in their scholarly work that they want to do. And so the next generation work sort of raised all of these questions. We write in there about these different generational narratives. Some people on the call here are probably going to share the narrative. This was certainly the narrative that made sense to me when I was doing the work in the 90s. So this is a piece that Parker Palmer did in 1992 in Change magazine. And he was talking about mid-career faculty, so post-tenure. These were often faculty who were doing service learning at the time. And the narrative in part was you don't do this until after you get tenure. But they also were having this sort of deep distress that everything that they cared about when they became faculty in their graduate work and then into the academy, those values had been sort of beat out of them in graduate school and beat out of them in the tenure and promotion process. And so they were at this point in their mid-careers where their values weren't connected to the work that they were doing. And they were essentially trying to put their lives back together again, this sense of being divided no more. And one way that they found to do that was through community engagement work, specifically through service learning, that they could put their lives back together, put their values back together with their practice, and find this sort of sense of inner healing. That made a lot of sense. It made sense in terms of when I entered into the work, and certainly the colleagues that I was working with. This was just sort of the way we understood how you went about this as a faculty member. And it was very much, you do this after you get tenure. Don't even think about doing it when you're trying to get tenure. So in that narrative then, there's not a whole lot about challenging the institutional structures. It's about how do you sort of survive within them, get to the point where then you can actually do the work that you want to do. The next generation narrative is really different. So they don't come to this work post-tenure. In many cases, they did this as undergraduates. They did it in their graduate studies, and they have deep expectations that they will continue to do it as scholars as they enter into the academy and into faculty careers. They don't come in with the sense that they're going to just wait for 6 years to be able to do this work. I remember a graduate student at a meeting saying that asking her to deny her scholarly identity for 6 years was just another form of structural violence, and it wasn't acceptable. So they come in with the expectation that they're going to do this work. They're looking for institutions where they can do it, and they're pretty savvy about making decisions about where they're going to go, where they can actually thrive as scholars. They don't want to go to places where they're going to get beat up trying to do the work that they want to do. And then the other part is that they come to our campuses as change agents. So they're not going to sort of just wait around, but they're actually going to push for the kinds of changes that are needed, whether it's in scholarship or teaching and learning, that that'll really allow them to do the work that they want to do and the work that they think needs to be done on our campuses. And so they don't sort of come into this training to heal these inner divisions. They don't have the inner divisions. They're going to not get to the point where they have to heal them. They don't want to be beat up in this process, and they're going to do everything they can not to be. So it's a very different kind of narrative. And then I just want to kind of reinforce the narrative where it comes from with some data. So in Publicly Engaged Scholar, we share this data looking at the Higher Education Research Institute. So you probably know Harry mostly from the freshman survey that they do every year. And it always gets a lot of play because it's how we begin to understand each generation of freshmen that come into our campuses. But they also do a faculty survey every 3 years. So the background to this is in the late 90s when the Astons were running the Higher Education Research Institute. They were very much connected to the work around service learning, really interested in what was happening with community engagement work. And they realized that it was something that was moving from the margins of higher education right into the mainstream. And so they wanted to try to get some data from the Higher Education Research Institute about community engagement. So in the early 2000s, they asked questions around community engagement for the first time. So 2004, 2005, and I think there were 6 questions related to community engagement. So we focused on just one of them here, which was the question: during the past 2 years, have you collaborated with the local community in teaching/research? So it's not a perfect question, but it's a pretty good question, because we could argue around what do you mean by collaboration, but it gives us a sense sort of what faculty we're actually doing. So here's what that data looks like. I'll break this down into smaller chunks, but what we did was we looked at 2004, 2005. That was the first time that question was asked. And so then it was asked in another cycle 3 years later, another cycle 3 years later. So the 2013-14 is about 10 years after the first one. And then the third column is the change in response. And then what we did was we disaggregated it. So you'll see at the top there, it's just at the institution level, but then we wanted to know about academic rank and tenure status and sex, race, and ethnicity. The one thing I'll just point out here is no matter how you slice it, on the right-hand column, it increases, and increases in some cases significantly. So if we break it down sort of to look at some of the other ones, here's just at the institutional level. So you can see the change from 2004 to 2014, 6.5%. So that 48.8%, if we look at cross higher education, all institutions, essentially half the faculty say that they collaborate with the local community in their teaching/research. And then if you do it public and private, you can see public more than private. But you also see a significant change from 2004 to 2014 in the private, an 8.1% shift. And then if you look at it here, women more than men, and then faculty of color more than white faculty. And again, you can see some of the increases on the far right side over that 10-year period. Some of them really stand out here, like the Hispanic faculty. So this data is telling us a couple things. One is, again, the faculty who are more diverse, it seems like they have a tendency to want to claim scholarly identities around community engagement in really deep ways. And over a 10-year period, we see these shifts tells us that there's something generationally going on as well. So it's pretty powerful data. We're looking at the 16-17 data now. And I'll just point out here that the question is slightly different, and I would argue it's a better question now. So it says, over the past 2 years, have you collaborated with the local community on research/teaching to address their needs? So it's a better question around community engagement. But again, you'll see this isn't disaggregated because we haven't done that work yet. We're in the midst of doing it now. But again, you can see you're talking about half the faculty say they do this. Which is pretty astounding. And I just have to say, what happens when I talk particularly to administrators is I always ask them, do you have a reward structure on your campus that values what half the faculty say they do? And I have yet to come across somebody who says, oh yeah, we have that. I also just want to point out the NESI results. And my guess is probably every one of your campuses does NESI. And these results were very different 10 years ago. And so I think looking at them now is really important. So I want you to pay attention to two things here. One is the lists of practices, service learning, learning community, research with faculty, those are the high impact practices. So just look at the numbers here in terms of where the participation is in high impact practices. And you can see here that there's higher participation generally in service learning, but certainly in terms of students of color. And other than learning communities, service learning is the only high impact practice where there's a greater participation of students of color than there are of white students. And so again, I think we need to pay attention to this, not only in terms of the demographic shifts that have taken place in terms of students, but then thinking in terms of who are the faculty that are involved in teaching these courses, and the kinds of connections, again, between community engagement and student success. Because what we know from the high impact practices is that we have much more engagement in learning and therefore persistence and success of students, particularly for underserved students. So this data actually is really powerful. And these numbers are continuing to shift to higher participation year by year. So if you compare this to the 2018 data, the 19 are actually higher. So there's definitely a trend going on here, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. All right, so let's take a pause here because I'm tired of talking. So Ari, you want to?
A couple things, John, too, about kind of why I was hoping that you would share this. I know, so I remember being at the ASCU CLDE conference about the time 2010, 2011, when Democratic Engagement White Paper came out, and I was at a session with you and Matt Hartley, one of the co-authors, and presenting it, and I was with Matthew Johnson, who was at the time at Siena College running the Bonner program there. And for us, hearing the information was kind of like a lot of aha moments went off, like, he's talking about Bonner. You know, like essentially, when we saw the framework, we were like, but that's what we do, all those things. We weren't necessarily using the language, epistemology, but the concepts behind it, the idea that the knowledge of the community is valued equally with that of the faculty and the students, that was like core to who we are.
Yep.
We weren't necessarily talking in scholarly terms about institutional change, but that has always been a goal of the Bonner program, to change the culture and the infrastructure of the campuses. So this was something that we found then, and that literature became kind of core literature for the High Impact Initiative, and also for, we had at Allegheny with Dave, did a meeting with Provost in 2015. And a lot of the folks that came to it, including academic deans, said when they went home, they're like, you gave us the language we needed for legitimacy, like to be able to explain the kinds of changes we're trying to make, and to also back them up. So that was really helpful. And I think also then from John, I became almost a student of John's. John was part of my own dissertation study. Matt Hartley was my chair, and even my pilot study. So that gave me a different frame on things, because then realized that it's actually important that schools use this language publicly when you talk about your center, when you talk about your work, because again, it connects you to the scholarship and to the field in a really clear, visible way. So does that make sense what I'm saying? So that's a little bit where.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
On it, yeah.
Yep.
But just to open it up, does anyone else have comments or questions? And I think we're going to go into a breakout. But before we do.
Yeah, feel free to jump in. Don't be hesitant.
Well, I'll make one more Bonner connection then. And I sent John the student impact survey report that we just sent out, and that's on our website. And it's interesting because in it, the data really does back up like what you're seeing there with like the NESI data. Because again, in the Bonner program, the majority of students are students of color. They are low-income students, often first-generation students. And what we know is that through Bonner, they're actually going through a series of those high-impact experiences, not just one or two, which generally in higher ed, students only get one or two. So that was also another clear place in where we saw that connection with diversity. And it's interesting, I don't know if there's any faculty on the call. What we felt was that often in Bonner, we've been more practitioner and we haven't published a lot. So sometimes some of what we do well is not really in the literature. But we've started to see a new wave of young faculty who are also Bonner alumni, who are now working like in partnerships with the centers and the staff on their campuses.
Yeah, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Some of them might be on the call. I don't know if they are, but either way.
Yeah. Right, so let's do the breakout so they can have some small group discussion, and then we'll come
So
back.
why don't you introduce the questions, John, and then I'll go ahead and send folks into the breakout.
All right, so we're going to put you in breakouts, but I know from breakouts that often I don't ever pay attention to what I'm supposed to do, so feel free to do whatever you want to do. But just a couple of ways to think about this is how do you see the connections between diversity, inclusion, and equity, connecting with community engagement and student success on your campus? Like, is that happening? And if so, how is it happening? And is there alignment on your campus between the scholarship of the younger, more diverse faculty and the institutional reward system? So you can use those if you want, but again, if you want to talk about any other part of this, that's fine too. So Ari, can you put them in groups?
In terms of time, it's 3:53. Should we take about 7 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to join one of them. I think you can too, John, if you want.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you were going to do that.
Yeah, I'm good. I'll go join number 2.
Okay.
Where you are.
Yes, I'm at University of Lynchburg.
How are you?
Hey there, Ari. Our center is new. This is only, really, we're finishing our first year as a center for community engagement. So we're in the midst of a strategic planning process, and this is a large component of it and what we're doing. And we're really connecting with, we actually have a new officer of equity and inclusion too. So we're really connecting with that new person to really think more strategically and intentionally about the work that we do and how we do it and how we engage all students on campus. So we're starting that process right now.
You know, I think it's such an interesting question because I'm at Maryville College and we have a long, as a small private liberal arts college, we have a long history of both engagement and social justice. But I think when we look at faculty scholarship, we have viewed engagement and diversity as sort of two initiatives that are parallel. And I think bringing those together is going to be really powerful. And I think it's going to be a priority for us. We have always viewed, one of the things that we've struggled with is having diverse faculty. It has been an initiative and we've struggled to attain it. And in bringing together these two, I think will be transformative for us. Mm-hmm. And that they're not parallel, that they're very, very much interconnected. It is a new framework that we haven't, I don't think we've fully explored, that these two are intertwined. I think is really going to be interesting.
Did you all get to meet Caitlin and Holly yet? Or?
Not yet.
No.
I think they're still muted.
Hey guys, I'm Caitlin. I'm not really in a physical place where I can talk, so I'm hoping that I can just listen. But I'm so excited to be, I'm just for reference, I'm adjunct faculty at Montclair State University.
Oh, great. And what discipline are you in?
Theater studies.
Okay, cool.
So thank you so much for this. I'm really excited to listen to kind of what you all are contributing.
I understand.
I'm just one of the couple students that joined, so I'm also just kind of here to listen.
Where are you, Holly?
I'm in Topeka, Kansas. I'm a graduate of Washburn University, and now I'm a graduate student at Kansas State.
What are you studying?
I'm doing college student development because I would like to be an advisor.
Cool. Well, tell us how, from your point of view, does it ring true in terms of your experience as a student or grad student, the connections of like civic and diversity work?
I would say so. I mean, at the moment, for my final, this is actually my last semester, so I haven't spent a ton of time on campus. Before all of the distancing stuff, I would only be there like once every other week. So I'm honestly not that familiar with what goes on at K-State at the moment.
Yeah.
I can't answer this very well, sorry.
Okay. What about your time at Washburn?
Yeah, I would say so. Once again, I haven't been around much lately. I graduated in 2017, and I was actually invited. My undergrad advisor was like, oh, here, I asked if you could join, so she let me come in.
Yeah. For me, and I was for college out in California, and the community that I served in was predominantly of color, 98%. And, you know, I'm from Lake Tahoe, so I was from white person from a predominantly white city and town, small town, mountains. But that was actually my biggest mentor, the one actually that introduced me to John and to Wayne and Bobby, was the Dean of Multicultural Education, Greg Ricks. He was kind of like a mentor. And he was involved. I met him because he was training students involved with the Haas Center for Public Service as part of our retreat. So my experience was very much race and ethnicity was a huge part of my experience in terms of both the motivation, like to serve, and what I was doing in the community, and what I did like or didn't like about class, which I was a political science major, but I could always read like theories of justice, and then I would think about East Palo Alto and like how things were drastically different there, like the funding for schools and everything, infrastructure, sidewalks. So it definitely speaks to me. And I think one thing missing from the literature is the community partner dimension of it too, like because it's not just about diverse, whether, you know, diverse students, you know, whether you look like or are from the same background as the community or the rest of your college, but also the community, you know? So like, and the way, like, cause to me, those community partners were just as significant mentors as the faculty and staff on campus. They really were the ones who like took me under their wing and like introduced things to me. And yeah, they really inspired me and motivated me. So and that's one thing I noticed in the literature, I think it's just, this is an area there's not very much on. And that was something we're really excited about with our student impact survey, and why we built in like all these questions about the impact of the partners, because we really think that the partners are also having a huge educational impact on students. So.
I must have been your neighbor. I was in Sonoma.
Oh yeah, oh cool. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You have the same name as from California.
Right. Yeah, I love Tahoe.
Yeah. So. But I've also found there's really good data to back this up too around the companion to NESE is called the FESI, the Faculty Survey of Student Engagement. And that has also shown that same thing that John was suggesting around practices of faculty, engaged learning and teaching practices, and how women actually, as well as faculty of color, have more of that, or do them more often than other faculty. So it's interesting. That's the timer I set to remind us about the room. So although that clock is different than the other one, my microwave. But anyway, well, cool. We probably should go back soon. I'll go back and then see where John is if he's. See y'all. Hey, John, should we call everyone back?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay.
Hey, Ari, this is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Somehow I got my participation got frozen or something. I had to leave and then log back in, and so I've been sitting here waiting with.
I'm sorry. Well, we can talk with you for a moment. It's great to have all your folks involved.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the breakout, because I would have liked to have heard people saying.
Yeah.
Maybe the next breakout. I assume we'll have another one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like you could even just have a discussion with your cohort about those the themes presented, right? In terms of
yes.
Yeah, for sure. I think people should be coming back, because what they said, it's supposed to end them all in 60 minutes. Oh, here they come. Woo. All right. How was your discussion? Can we hear from maybe 3 people? Should I pick on someone or no? Dave Roncolado.
Oh,
go ahead. Someone else was going to go.
I was going to say this is Gilo at Spelman College, and it was really nice to hear from other schools about what's happening there. At Spelman, we have not a lot of formal recognition for faculty who are working toward tenure and promotion. There's not a lot of formal recognition in the process of their participation, but there is still a lot of support, and there are other, their work, when they do this type of work, the president will lift it up, it will show up on the website. It just doesn't count toward their formal tenure and promotion work. So it seems like that was also the case in other places, even at some places without even that sort of unofficial recognition and support for the faculty who are doing that work.
Thanks, Gilo. I know I'll say that many of the schools that are on the call are part of our community engaged learning initiative. And in that, there are 2 components, and one was an institutional change project. There were like 7 of those 24 schools. Changing tenure was one of the focus areas for them. And I know maybe I can actually invite Ariane from Maryville to say something, because when we had checked in, she had talked about where they were at with it.
Hey, Ari.
Yeah.
Can you? I think you logged in as me. Can you make Rachita the host, or Liz? So I can start a second meeting.
I logged in as you. Oh, I logged in as Bonner. Okay, sure.
That's all right. Just make them the host. Just tell me when you've done that, so I don't log you out when I log back in. Hi, John.
I thought you were joining us, Bobby.
Hi, everybody. No, I'm not staying long. I have to run a Teaching Social Action webinar right now.
Hey, Bobby, I don't know how to do that now that I'm in it. Let me see. Because it doesn't have that option.
Choose participants.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right, Liz. Make co-host, Liz.
No, make them the host.
Okay, I'm making you the host, Liz.
It's a lot of power, Liz. Good luck. All right, nice to see everybody. Sorry about the interruption.
Bye. Bye. All right. Anyway, can I invite Ariane to say something from Maryville about where you are with the process?
Were you referring to
with the tenure and promotion? You had about the handbook changes you were making?
Yeah, so we're in the process of having faculty-wide discussions about clarifying our language. It is implicit that it is valued, but it is not as explicit as it could be. And there's a lot of value in flexibility and the culture of flexibility in the tenure promotion system. So there's some worry about making it, if we make it more specific, are we removing flexibility? I think that speaks to what John was talking about earlier. If there has been very minimal pushback, but the pushback has been with some of the more senior faculty, and some worries may fall under the sort of some of the myths and some misunderstanding about the role of community engagement and scholarship that we're hoping next year to continue to discuss and clarify and build some clarification to support our youngest faculty that have a lot more comfort around this level of scholarship.
All right, can I add a word about that? One thing this is Dave from Allegheny, one thing that I recall that has been very helpful from John's insights around this work is that we're looking for institutional change. There's structural change and there's cultural change, and they don't happen concurrently. Allegheny, we have new language in our handbook about tenure and promotion, and yet there has been quite a slow lag, behind in terms of cultural change, especially on the departmental level. And so I think we need to just highlight just how important this work is, and yet how it takes time and it's hard work. And I don't know if John, you wanted to say anything in related to that.
Yeah, I would just second that, Dave. I think, part of it is how do you drive it down into the departments, and then how do you think about this in terms of culture? So I remember IUPUI, which is part of this network, had changed their promotion and tenure guidelines like way ahead of everybody else. This was back in the 90s. And the provost was just thrilled. It took him 10 years to do it with the faculty, and they changed the guidelines, but then nothing changed. And as one of my colleagues said, policies don't vote. Right? And so part of it was you have the policies, but you got to figure out how to change the culture. So one of the things they did, and Ariane, this is something that you might think about too, is they instituted a policy where nobody could sit on a personnel review committee without going through a workshop on how to evaluate the scholarship of engagement. And then they found things really changed. And it partly was that the older faculty just had no idea what this was. So they had no idea how to evaluate it. So they just kept doing what they always did. And so even though the policy was there, the culture just remained the same. So it's part of how do you think about now, how do you get those deeper shifts to take place? And changing the language in the policy is one piece, but it's not going to get you everything you need. And it's one piece to do it at the institutional level, like at Allegheny, but it's not going to get you what you need unless you drive it down to the departmental level. So a good example of where campus has done this is University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And we're currently doing a study there, and that data will be available hopefully within the next 6 months or so. But what happened at UNC Greensboro was that in 2010, they changed their institution level guidelines. And so it specifically has language around community engagement in teaching and in their research and in their service. But then what happened was that the provost charged all the units, so the 7 colleges and 54 departments, to all revise their policies to align with the institution level policies. And they did. And so that's what we're actually studying. We're looking at those 54 departments and 7 colleges to see what they did. But it goes back to what Dave said, unless you drive it down where faculty live in their departments, it's really hard to get traction with this stuff. So it's a long-term strategic sort of plan. How do you think about this to really shift the culture? And there's lots of different pieces to it, but there's no silver bullet. You got to have a bunch of different pieces. It's like Peter Yule talks about, multiple interventions simultaneously. That's how you create transformational change. So that's how I think about it.
Terry Dolson's raising her hand. She has something to say.
Go ahead, Terry.
I have a question actually to follow up on that, John Saltmarsh. It does seem to me as you get to the more nitty-gritty levels is where the change really lives. And as we're trying to do that with individual departments around tenure, working with young scholars who are actually we're working with ones who have tenure and are trying to get promoted, and saying and figuring out what questions are coming up. And it's interesting to me that I wonder if it's still going to have to be answered individually for different departments and disciplines. So my question is, does community engagement look different as scholarship for different disciplines? I know I go back to the general ideas, which were great with, it's escaping me. The ideas about how we're rethinking community engaged scholarship from Boyer and those guys. But it seems to me it needs to be even more specific. Like, how do you decide which reviewers get asked? And how do you find the right kinds of community engaged reviewers? Things like that, which come down to very discipline specific concerns.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I think that's part of what we're seeing at Greensboro. So when it gets driven down to the departments, a whole bunch of issues come up that really aren't in the institution level guidelines. So I'll just mention 3 in particular. So one is, what's a scholarly product?
Yes.
And again, that's going to look different in different disciplines. But is there sort of a sense of an expansive view of what a scholarly product in that particular discipline could look like and be valued? So it's not just a peer-reviewed journal article. What else would it be? What does it look like in architecture? What does it look like in sociology, et cetera, right? So that's, and that has to get addressed. Like if you don't address that, you're not going to move the community engagement work forward. Yeah. Another one is, so who's a peer in peer review? Right? Because if we stick to only peers or people that have academic credentials in the university, then it's not going to actually work. You've got to open up a sense of where the knowledge expertise lies, and then who's considered a peer. And then the third one is impact. Right? And so unless you have a different way of determining what counts as impact, it's really hard to move a community engagement agenda forward. And if you just get stuck in these kind of absurd measures around impact factors in journals, then you're not going to be able to move a community engagement agenda. And so you've got to come up with different ways of thinking about impact. And again, I would argue that the different departments, depending on their disciplinary orientation, already have different ways that they're thinking about impact and are wanting to get away from these measures that we've begun to really sort of just think are the norm when they actually aren't useful measures at all. And the literature is sort of pointing out that they aren't useful measures. So those are just 3. There are others too that are beginning to emerge. Like there's a really interesting thing that we're looking at around rigor, what's considered rigor. But that looks different in different disciplines too. So how do they begin to use these? And this is all at the department level. You don't see this at an institution level guideline, because that's where the rubber hits the road. So yeah, I agree with you completely, and it does look different, but part of what was really nice about the way it worked out at UNCG was it was up to the departments to figure it out. It wasn't like the provost said, here's what you have to put in your guidelines. You've got to figure it out. I would also just tell you, completely honestly, that some of the departments just didn't do it. Like the only place that shows up in the mathematics department is to say that we're not going to incorporate community engaged scholarship. It's the only place the language shows up, which is unfortunate, but so that's part of the reality too. There are some departments that just weren't going to do this. So.
Todd has his hand raised as well.
Thanks. Hey there. So one of I'm a scholar of communication. I work a lot with organizational culture. And one of the things I find over and over again is that in vertical organizations like our universities, as we've been saying, change doesn't come from the top down. It's got to come from the bottom up. So we're very interested in, we've been talking a lot about moving towards developing or nurturing community engaged academic units so that those can really build and hopefully kind of gravitate upwards. So my first question is really about resources for thinking about building community engaged academic units. My second question is one that's much more at the larger, higher level. We have an initiative, in fact, it's in conjunction with Bonner, which is to build a community assembly, or an assembly across the campus of units, academic and administrative, that are dealing with community engagement in different ways to conjoin resources, to share information, to help develop partnerships. But something that's really interesting is that the upper administration finds this very interesting for the reason that they see it as an opportunity to mush in or lump in with that things like development, public relations, things which really aren't necessarily part of our kind of value or ethical mission of community engaged work. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, usually what I hear from campuses is the last thing that they want is public relations. And it's like Harry Boyd used to say, it's about public relationships, not public relations. And so that's always a tension, I think. So how do you draw that line? And there are some campuses that actually merge them pretty well. Like I think the University of Pennsylvania is one of those. But I think on many campuses, it's a real tension. So the other part, going back to where you started, Todd, is that thinking about organizational change, there's like the top down, bottom up. But I think the reality is you need both, and you need the top to facilitate the bottom coming up, right? And part of this is something that I learned in a study that we did looking at changes in reward policies. And what we found is that where they changed was where the upper administration actually encouraged change from below and supported it and funded it and drove it, essentially allowing the bottom to come up. And it was really interesting because I would talk to provosts and presidents who I knew were really leading this sort of effort on their campus, and they would say, no, we didn't do anything. We just let the faculty do it. But what they were really doing was that they were creating structures and processes to empower the faculty to actually be able to do it. And then it was accomplishing the agenda that they wanted accomplished. So it's like, I think they both work in tandem. The other thing that we learned in that study was that, and we weren't looking for this at all, but it became really clear that deans became really important. And deans were right at that point, halfway between the bottom up and the top down. And we talked about them as gatekeepers, because that's the way that the data really came across, is that they were the ones that either could make this work in a college or completely kill it. And so that's just a piece that I think we need to pay more attention to, is sort of who are the key players in this work. And I don't think we actually pay attention to deans as much as we should. The other two things I would just say about your question, one is that in terms of kind of where to put investments and efforts, there's a whole literature around engaged departments, which has been in place since the early 2000s. And I think that work is actually still really important work, and I still see campuses doing engaged department initiatives as a way to move the engagement work forward. There's a slightly newer body of work which emerged out of a project that I did on my campus with a dean there. So our dean of education at the time essentially was tired of trying to move the institution and just wanted to be an engaged college. So we were in his office one day and he just said, you know, what would it mean to be an engaged college? There's no literature around it. We have the department level, we have the institution level, but nothing around the college level. So we created this initiative, we created an assessment rubric, we piloted it with 4 campuses, and we just published all that work in the e-Journal of Public Affairs in the fall. And so it's all publicly accessible, the rubric's publicly accessible. And so that's just another kind of way to begin to think about this. And one of the things that we learned in that project was the campuses that we did it on, the 4 campuses all had really strong centers. So they were like really doing good engagement work. They had the infrastructure, they had leadership. They've been doing it for a while. They were all Carnegie classified. But what they realized as they started to do this work and doing the assessment using the rubric was that the centers actually didn't meet the needs of the colleges in the ways that if you really wanted it deep in the college. Like they would have faculty fellows, so a fellow might be from the college who would do this work out of the center, but it wasn't coming back into the college in a way that really changed the college. And so it led them to think about we need deeper connections. On 2 of the campuses, they actually created positions of community engagement, people who had it in their work, who were in the college now, that was their job. And they hadn't thought about that before because they just weren't making these connections. So that's just another piece I would think about, particularly at a place like your campus, who has been doing this for a really long time now. And so how do you sort of get to the next level? And I would think something like an engaged college would actually be a really interesting piece. One of the campuses that we did it with, the college was a College of Arts and Sciences in that case. And they were really intentional. They said to us, we're doing this so that we can create a model for the other colleges on our campus. And our goal is to have every college be an engaged college, right? So that's the kind of strategic thinking that can go along with it too.
John, thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Todd, I put a little link on the chat that might interest you that has a link to a lot of the literature.
Oh, that's excellent. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and Ari, link it to the e-Journal from the fall issue.
Okay. So John, I know, do you want to cover a little bit about the next piece, the critical service learning and social justice? I know that might interest folks.
Yeah, so and maybe we'll try to do this fairly quickly, but you know, when Ari and I were preparing this, one of the questions she asked me is sort of, where's the field going? What are the shifts that we see taking place? So that was just one part I just wanted to talk a little bit about. And I will try to do this fairly quickly so that we, again, have more time for some conversation. So let me go back to the slides here. Okay, so my answer to that question was that what I see happening is a real shift towards what I think of as critical community engagement. And a leading scholar in this work is Taniya Mitchell. So in 2008, she published her first piece around critical service learning, drawing distinctions between what she calls traditional service learning and critical service learning. And then you can see from here, there's a whole bunch of stuff that she's written and continues to write and get deeper into this sense of what does it mean to do critical service learning and critical community engagement. But then there's like a whole other body of literature too, besides Taniya's work. And I just mentioned a few of them here, and I'll talk about a couple of them. So Brandon Kleiwer, he did a piece on why the civic engagement movement cannot achieve democratic justice aims. And then I really highly recommend Jennifer Simpson's work. Jennifer actually comes out of communications as well, Todd. So she did a book called Longing for Justice in 2014. And the center chapter of that book, chapter 3, is all about the community engagement movement. And it's a really, really good critique, both Brandon's work and Jennifer's work. So just quickly, the distinction drawn between service learning and critical service learning, key points of departure are working to redistribute power, developing authentic relationships, and working from a social change perspective. And again, Ari, I think this resonates really strongly with the Bonner work. And then the way that Taniya talks about it is each of these distinctions has a community and a classroom component. So this is the way that she diagrams it in her work. And so again, just so you can begin to see the differences between traditional service learning and critical service learning, particularly around these dimensions of the social change, working to redistribute power, and developing authentic relationships. And that has to have both, again, a classroom component and a community component. And then Jennifer's work, this particularly chapter 3, if you take a look at that, it's largely a critique of the white paper, and it's a really important critique coming out of a critical lens. And so again, just to do this really briefly, she said there's sort of 5 problems with the democratic engagement work from a critical perspective. One is the failure to identify that all scholarship has a political agenda, or what she calls the illusion of neutrality, right? And I'll just go through these because we don't have really time to unpack them all. But again, I just want to suggest these are really important critiques. Another is that it doesn't articulate explicit democratic outcomes tied to the values, or what she calls refusal to name the material practices and consequences of injustice. And I would argue she's completely right here. Like, I think this is a really important critique. So the other part is it doesn't address the role of power, what she says obscures the workings of privilege and power. It doesn't tie the norms of democratic culture to concrete practices of injustice at the individual and institutional level, or what she calls the refusal to name injustice. And then the last is that she says the suggestion that democratic norms have been beneficent to all in equitable ways represents a dismissal of history and radical denial of current practices, or what she calls uncritically accepting democratic norms. In other words, different people in the population don't experience democracy the same way. And some have experienced democracy in ways which have been largely marginalizing and oppressive. And again, I would argue these are really good critiques. And then Brandon Clewer also offers a critique of the democratic engagement white paper in the sense that it doesn't account for neoliberalism, or what he says, it fails to consider the way that neoliberal ideology, and I gotta get rid of this here. Whoops, sorry. And the context of market-based society are stalling the civic engagement field's potential to transform our democracy. This is a significant oversight. And to maintain robust levels of community engagement in the direction of social justice, the movement needs to recognize and challenge the structures of neoliberalism. Again, I would say this is a really important critique. So I offer this just as a way to begin to pull a bunch of these critiques together into a model where we could begin to think about what critical community engagement could look like. And again, we could spend a lot of time unpacking this. But you can see here, there's the community part, there's the campus part, that they completely connect with one another, and that the critical perspective influences both of them, and that the student experiences here are tied to community cultural wealth, and in other words, the student assets that they're bringing into the learning that's happening on the campus. You see the faculty piece is faculty identity and scholarship tied to epistemological values and pedagogical stances. And all of that is tied to this sort of these areas of critique which need to be embedded into the work. So on the right-hand side then, a focus on institutions and structures. In other words, not a focus on individuals, but looking carefully at institutions and the structures that are creating sort of inequality and oppression. Examine positionality and implication. And I would argue that's like for all of these pieces, for students, for faculty, what is our positionality and what is the implication of our work in either perpetuating or working against inequality and certain power dynamics. And so the third is attend to structural power dynamics, right? Bringing forward power and privilege into our thinking about community engaged work. Address systemic change that will reduce inequality and oppression. Specify public priorities and democratic outcomes. Name racialized inequality. Identify practices and consequences of injustice, and attend to historical underpinnings of injustice. So the community engagement work, if we were doing it from a socially just perspective, would bring all of these dimensions into it in a way that traditional community engagement just doesn't. And even though the democratic engagement work and the full participation work and the next generation work begin to work more towards a critical lens, it doesn't work this far. And I would argue that this is sort of the direction that the work both is going, the really sort of cutting edge work in community engagement, but also exactly where it needs to go. And again, this just sort of comes out of then countering neoliberalism through public engagement. And here's what some scholars are already writing about, that the logic of neoliberalism includes relentless attachment to privatization and the destruction of an ethical and relational public. And as one scholar writes, for critics of the neoliberal model, universities become places of civic engagement. And one answer to the abuses of neoliberalism become the engaged campus. So it sets up this interesting piece in terms of this focus on the public purposes of higher education, creating a counter to what we are really sort of embedded in this neoliberal model. And then again, just sort of what would critical community engagement look like? We don't need to read through this, but it's just a way to begin to sort of frame out what would a critical community engagement lens look like, what would be the components of it, and then the question is, how would we bring it into practice? So to just jump ahead here even more quickly, the work that I'm currently focusing on in part is around this idea of epistemic equity. So coming back to epistemology, raising these questions of equity. And so one of the pieces that Ari shared with you is this chapter in a book that's just coming out. It was supposed to be out at the end of March, but I think it got delayed. I highly recommend it. So Colette Kahn and Eric de Moulinaar, this book on activist academics. And in the afterwards, I write about this lens of epistemic equity. So this comes right out of that chapter. So the focus first is on equity. And so what would that mean in the context of higher education? You can see the language in that third paragraph around thriving, which I talked about earlier. And so regarding scholarship, like community engaged scholarship, enacting epistemic equity would mean examining and responding to the impact higher education systems have on privileging whose knowledge is valued, what research is legitimized, and who gets to participate in the creation and spread of knowledge. And then it would have these different dimensions. And you can again see sort of the literature that this comes from, and particularly Miranda Fricker's work. So Miranda Fricker did a book called Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. She's a philosopher, a British philosopher. Essentially what she does is make an argument that epistemology has not only an intellectual dimension, but an ethical dimension. And then she begins to take apart what that ethical dimension looks like. And it fundamentally then raises these questions of justice tied to how we think about knowledge, which has, I think, deep implications for our work. And so if we think about epistemic equity, then it would be aimed at institutional coupling of diversity and inclusion commitments with organizational structures, policies, and practices. It's just what we've been talking about when we've been talking about reward structures and who are the scholars that get rewarded, who's doing community engagement work, how identity is tied to scholarship. It would have an asset-based approach that values the inclusion of voices that have historically been discounted, delegitimized, and marginalized through academic cultures and practices, foregrounds identity and power in an analysis of ethics and justice, countering systems default processes that silence and delegitimize certain knowers and ways of knowing, creating this sense of epistemic exclusion. And then it would strategically shape our institutional cultures and structures and practices to identify and address prejudicial exclusion of scholars from participation in the spread of knowledge through credibility discounting and epistemic marginalization. So in some ways, I think going back to what Ari said, what I'm trying to do here is give us a way to talk about this, provide language for what is already happening in our systems, but we don't have a good language to talk about these forms of injustice. So that's what I'm trying to do here with this epistemic equity work. But again, it is very much tied to sort of this critical lens. So we were going to stop here again for breakout, but I think maybe what we should do is just sort of open it up again, Ari.
That sounds really good.
And I know we're
And I
close.
think I want to point out that, because if folks haven't had a chance to look at the article Full Participation, for example, I think one of the ways that this becomes more concrete is like take a look at the case study of the faculty member in that. That's about her work and then her going up for tenure. And think about, you know, the experiences of, I was talking in my small breakout about one of the things I'm excited about with our student impact survey was that we really tried to focus on the knowledge of the community partner and the impact that the community partner themselves and that the experience students had with the partner is making on their academic gains. And that's something that I personally feel like is underrepresented in the literature, and I think goes along with what John is saying here too, right? Is there's all these things that are happening out in the community that are not necessarily reflected in what is captured as knowledge within the classroom. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. But anybody want to make any comments or questions? We still have most everyone on, so it's thank you for hanging on. We have 31 folks still, so it is 4:30. I know, but it's good that we had this nice 90 minutes. It didn't feel as rushed and it felt like a rich session. It would probably help us if before you signed off, if you could just in the chat, you know, make a comment in terms of either something you got from this or something you'd like to have more information on. And yes, Terry, the slides are on that page on the wiki that I put in the chat earlier. And anyone, you can actually save the chat before you log off. You just go to the chat on the side and put like save chat, and it'll download it to your desktop. We may just email it out to people though too, because there's some links and things in there that might help you.
And I would just say too, if you think those slides are helpful in terms of your own work on your campus, feel free to use them in any way that you'd like.
And one thing is I will also upload some slides that John has shared with us in the past. And that, again, a lot of that go more into the Echo Hill Green, institutional change, and some other pieces that people have found really helpful to share in campus conversations. And I do want to announce so that people might save the date. I don't think Tim Eatman's still on, but he's going to do a webinar with us on Friday, May 22nd, I think it is. And one of the things that Tim will be talking about more is tenure and promotion change as well, because when he was at Imagining America, he and some colleagues wrote a booklet that's often used in that work to talk about good process. Okay. Anything else you want to say, John, before we wrap up?
No, this is, I hope, helpful. It's actually great to connect with Bonner again. Good to see some faces that I haven't seen for a while.
It's great to have you involved. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh yeah, you bet. It's all your work is really important, and it makes a difference. And you know, another thing which Ari had thought we might talk about is the Carnegie classification. But one thing I told her is that when I read through the applications, you can almost immediately tell whether it's a Bonner school because the engagement work is different, and so there's a real difference that you're making on campuses, and the Bonner work is really special. I know there's like the Bonner love, but like it's really, there's something to it. So I just really want to sort of congratulate you all for that work.
Yay. It's good to get some props. So thanks. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Ari, for a great session. I appreciate it.
Thank you all, and hope you all have a relaxing and safe weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
I'll save the chat one more time before I.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for signing in. Take care.
Ari, should I make you the host again? Is it okay?
Just stay, Liz, and don't hang up yet, so I can say bye to John.
Sorry, I'm leaving. I'm just typing your
Bye.
note first. I'm just typing a note first. And I want to say thank you, yes, to John. I first saw you at Davidson at the Bonner meeting.
Oh, yeah.
I guess that's been 5 years ago now. So it had a lot of good impact on the work that's happening at Maryville. So I appreciate you being there then and being here today.
Oh, great. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, Savannah. Good seeing you.
Bye, it's good seeing you too. This is great.
Bye.
And I have my coworker here for.
Oh, yay. Where's your dog?
Oh, she left the room. She was at the end.
Your coworker's getting big there. Last time I saw him, he was in a stroller.
Yep. He's 5 now.
Oh my gosh. Time's flying.
Yeah. Well, have a wonderful weekend, y'all.
You. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. I thought that was great. What'd you think, Liz?
It was excellent, really excellent. I was taking notes and got a lot of really good information. My chat was really nice. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. Hey, and John, would you mind if I send out that that website of yours? I know we didn't talk about your teaching, but is that something I can send, or is it like a private? You have to invite people.
Yeah, I
Have to invite. Okay, never mind.
yeah, I try to keep it somewhat private.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was great. I really liked it, connecting the dots. In my small group breakout, like people were like, "Oh, Ariane from Maryville was like, yeah, we haven't really made that connection between diversity and civic engagement, and we're just starting to. And if we did, that could really shift things for us."
Yeah, that's what I find.
Hiring, which is the truth, man. I mean, like, yeah.
And when campuses figure it out, it like makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Places like University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so like their premier research land-grant institution. In 2011, in their strategic plan, they had 3 priorities, and one was to change the promotion and tenure guidelines.
Yeah.
And the way they talked about it was emerging forms of scholarship. So part of it was community engagement, part of it was digital scholarship, part of it was interdisciplinary scholarship. What they realized is that they didn't have a way to signal to young scholars that they could come there and do that work. So they were trying to figure out, how do we do that? But that's true for all of us, right? Like, so, and what's interesting is that it becomes largely this question of self-interest. And it's in their interest to attract the best young faculty. So how are they going to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that, like, Bates wasn't on this call, but they're one of the other schools that were working on it in this initiative. And I think they were getting pretty far. Maryville got far. But now they were worried about COVID and what might happen, because they're going to turn over the whole committee or whatever. So, yeah, I'm eager to see. We've sent the UNCG stuff out to lots of people before, like in both because Emily did a really good job documenting their whole process and stuff. And
Emily is
my case study from my dissertation.
Yeah, Emily's leading that research project. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, so we took all these documents, we have pre and post.
Yeah.
We did this massive coding using in vivo, and so it's really interesting.
Well, Liz is in a master's program now at Drexel, online higher ed, so she
great.
will talk to you at some point about her own research.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Lori did.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Gets to her doctorate, she might want to talk to you about that. And that person, Cindy Ferguson, she was on the call too. That was the one I mentioned. It's like wants to be pointed in the right direction for some good programs.
Okay, great.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks.
All right.
Friday afternoon.
I know. It's just like any other day. Right?
I know. At first I was happy we were doing these on Friday afternoon, but now I'm like, dang, it's like makes your whole day, you're like waiting and waiting. Come on. It's like, okay. Anyway, thanks, Liz. Thanks for helping with looking at the hands. I couldn't see them once you.
Yeah. Once I became the host, I realized that I was getting that information. So
thanks.
I figured I'd jump in just in case.
That was really helpful. All right. Well, have a great weekend.
Have a good day. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.